Hello, and welcome to the new Mindscape. Let's go back to that scene of the chicks on the conveyor belt in the film Baraka. When you see the image of thousands of baby chicks innocently chirping faint cries of distress, calling for their mother as they're shunted on the machine to their death, your heart jumps for them. Your heart can't stop gasping in a cry of pain and compassion. Humans have a unique capacity. We can empathize with others. We can feel for others, not only for other humans, but even for baby chicks. We can put ourselves in their shoes, imagining ourselves being them, and feel them. The pain and suffering of others becomes your own pain, and the joy of others becomes your own joy. Even though they're physically separate from you, they enter your mindscape. In a sense, they become part of you, so you can feel their feelings. A relationship arises between you and them. You imagine them as you and you as them. You imagine yourself on the conveyor belt, and you imagine yourself seeing the world from their perspective, and you cry for them. When you do that, your spirit begins to break out of the boundaries of your own body and ego. Think of your friend Amanda. When you think of your friend Amanda, Amanda comes into your mindscape. When you see her suffering, or when you think of her suffering, you feel some suffering too. When Amanda stands in your mindscape, when she speaks to you, at that moment, you take her position and you look at yourself from where she stands. You see yourself from Amanda's perspective. You may do things to please her or to avoid angering her. The Amanda you're pleasing may be the Amanda in your mindscape, not the Amanda in her material body, who may be far away and who maybe doesn't know what you're thinking about or doing, and maybe she doesn't even care. The more you got to know Amanda, the more she stood in your mindscape, the more you could see the world from her perspective, and to see yourself from her perspective. Your spirit can break out of the bounds of your own self and look at you from beyond yourself, from the perspective of another person. We can even imagine beings and dimensions without a material existence, and try to see the world from those perspectives, and live as if those beings and dimensions exist. And we can imagine ourselves projected into the future in an ideal state and strive to become that ideal projection, and then to look at ourselves from that ideal position. Humans are capable in their mindscape of projecting themselves into the perspective of other persons and beings, whether they're real or imaginary. It's partly out of this capacity that human spirituality grows. We do not always use this capacity, and we're perfectly capable of living only from the perspective of our own bodily comfort, security, and material reproduction. But an unexpected experience, an insight, the sight of the cry of suffering or injustice, or of moving self-sacrifice may jolt us into spiritual questions and reflections. Think of a person that you've never met who's not alive. Let's think, for example, if you were to plunge into the writings and stories of Confucius. Confucius will come into your mind, and his scenes and words will fill your mindscape. You'll start seeing the world from the perspective of Confucius, and you'll start seeing yourself from his perspective, as if he were talking to you. Or it could be the same if you read and reread Plato's stories about Socrates, and the words of Socrates and the scenes of his dialogues fill your mind. Socrates and Confucius had greater wisdom, knowledge, and understanding than you. The more you relate to them in your mindscape, the more you look at yourself and the world from their perspective, the more you'll acquire their wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. Socrates and Confucius saw the world from a higher perspective than almost anyone else. They saw beyond their own petty needs and desires. They saw beyond the needs and perspectives of Athens or of the kingdom of Qi. They saw the world from the vantage point of all of humanity and from the high development of the human body, mind, and spirit. When you let Confucius and Socrates talk to you through their words, stories, and writings, you also start to see the world from the perspective of all of humanity and from the perspective of highly developed human capacities. And so, through relationships with the objects of consciousness in your mindscape, your spirit can expand to ever greater horizons and capacities. Is there any limit to this potential expansion of the spirit? Let's do a thought experiment. Consider the concept of an omnipotent and omniscient God. A God who is all-powerful and all-knowing. A God who is infinitely loving, merciful, and compassionate. Can you imagine such a God? No, it's impossible. But still, just try. Try to imagine such a God. All-powerful. All-powerful means more powerful than the most powerful thing that exists in the world. All-knowing. That means this God is more knowledgeable than the most knowledgeable mind that exists in the world. Infinitely loving means more loving than the most loving person who exists in the world. Now, don't get into a mental debate about whether or not such a God exists. Just imagine such a God in your mindscape. Imagine having a relationship with such a God. You start to see the world from the perspective of such a God, and you see yourself from that perspective, and you act to be in a loving relationship with such a God. At one level, that's impossible. You can never imagine such a God. You can never imagine such power, knowledge, and love. You can never truly imagine such a relationship. It's beyond human imagination or comprehension. But at another level, by trying to imagine such a God, your spirit goes farther than anything it has ever previously imagined. You strive to go beyond anything that you've ever imagined before. You empower an object of consciousness that embodies all perfections. And in doing so, you expand your horizon farther than you've ever been before. You see the world and yourself from the highest vantage point than you could possibly imagine. And each time your spirit goes to that vantage point, it realizes that higher up, there are always infinitely more stars, galaxies, and universes. And by doing that, you see and empower your whole life in a different way.